We all have a certain picture of the Middle Ages in our heads, right? Knights in shining armor, majestic castles, maybe a fairy tale or two. But what if I told you the reality was a whole lot grimmer, and honestly, a lot smellier? Forget the storybooks. Today, we're digging up the harsh truths about the filth, disease, and downright bizarre justice of the medieval world. This was an era where survival was a daily fight, and life was often short and brutal. So, you might want to take a deep breath of fresh air while you still can, because we're about to dive in. Let's start with the smell. Picture this: you open your window in 14th century London, and instead of fresh air, you get a face full of, well, everything. People would shout a warning before emptying their chamber pots right out the window and into the street below. This wasn't a rare inconvenience, it was just how things were done. Medieval cities had no plumbing, no garbage trucks, and basically no idea what sanitation was. The narrow, winding streets were caked in a disgusting mix of mud, animal droppings, and human waste. The local river, which was often the only source of water for drinking and bathing, also served as the city's toilet. To cope with the overwhelming stench, people would carry little bouquets of flowers or herbs called nosegays just to walk around without gagging. And all of that filth. It was the perfect breeding ground for disease, turning every medieval city into a ticking time bomb of infection. If the streets didn't get you, the justice system might. Medieval courts were a terrifying mix of superstition and severe punishment. In the early Middle Ages, the whole innocent until proven guilty thing hadn't really caught on. Instead, you might face a trial by ordeal. Accused of a crime, you might have to carry a red-hot bar of iron. If your hand was healing cleanly after 3 days, you were innocent. If it was infected, you were guilty. Another favorite was trial by water. An accused woman might be tied up and thrown into a river. If she floated, she was guilty and would be executed. If she sank, she was innocent, but probably already dead. While these ordeal trials faded over time, punishments remained horrifying public spectacles. Minor crimes might get you a fine, but serious offenders faced grim fates. A thief could have a hand cut off, and counterfeiters could be boiled alive. These weren't carried out behind closed doors. They were public events, meant to serve as a warning and, disturbingly, as a form of entertainment. Just when you think medieval justice couldn't get any weirder, you find out it wasn't just for humans. That's right, animals could be put on trial. There are historical records of formal animal trials across Europe, complete with judges and lawyers. This wasn't a joke. People in the Middle Ages genuinely believed animals were subject to God's law and could be held morally responsible for their actions. Pigs were the most common defendants, often for attacking children. In one infamous case in 1386, a pig in Falaise, France, was tried and found guilty of murdering an infant. It was then dressed in human clothes and publicly hanged. It wasn't just pigs either. In Basel, Switzerland, in 1474, a rooster was put on trial and burned at the stake for the heinous and unnatural crime of laying an egg, which was believed to be a tool of witchcraft. Even insects like weevils or caterpillars were sometimes taken to court and formally excommunicated. If you got sick in the Middle Ages, you'd have a tough choice: suffer through the illness or risk a visit from the doctor. Medieval medicine was a terrifying collection of guesswork. The leading theory was that the body was governed by 4 humors, and sickness was just an imbalance. The most common solution: bloodletting. Barber surgeons would use leeches or a knife to drain your blood to cure anything from a fever to the plague. This often just made the patient weaker or caused a fatal infection. If you needed surgery, you'd have to endure it with primitive anesthetics. One popular concoction, known as dwale, was a mix of things like boar bile, hemlock, opium, and henbane. If the poisonous brew didn't kill you, you'd wake up in absolute agony. And some of the other treatments were just as horrifying. Doctors might prescribe consuming powdered mummy, believing it had curative powers, or even ground up human skull to treat headaches. For a medieval woman, giving birth was one of the most dangerous things she could do. Without modern medicine, it was a terrifying and often fatal experience. While the popular myth that 1 in 3 women died in childbirth is an exaggeration, the danger was very real. Each birth carried about a 1 to 2% risk of death, and since women often had many children, that risk added up over a lifetime. Infant mortality was also tragically high, with some estimates suggesting up to a third of children didn't survive to age 5. The birthing room was a women-only space, attended by a midwife whose skills could vary wildly. With no way to handle complications like a breech birth, the death of both mother and child was a real possibility. Many women wrote their wills before going into labor. The process was a mix of practical care and superstition. A midwife might untie all the knots in the house or rub the mother's thighs with a gemstone, hoping to ease a difficult birth. For the overwhelming majority of people, the peasant's life was a never-ending grind for food. Famine was a constant, looming threat. A single failed harvest could lead to mass starvation. The typical peasant diet was incredibly bland, mostly consisting of bread, a watery porridge called pottage, and weak ale, since water was often too contaminated to drink. Meat was a rare luxury, and hunting in the Lord's forest was a crime punishable by death. When famine hit, people ate whatever they could find: grass, acorns, even tree bark. Eating moldy rye bread could lead to a painful and deadly condition called ergotism, which caused convulsions and hallucinations. In the darkest of times, there were even reports of cannibalism. For a peasant, every day was a battle against hunger. Forget the romantic image of the chivalrous knight. For many, the reality was a dirty, brutal, and not so honorable profession. A boy started training to be a knight as young as 7. Serving as a page, then, at 14, he'd become a squire, which was basically an internship of endless grunt work, cleaning armor, tending to horses, and running errands for a fully fledged knight. If you weren't born into a noble family, good luck becoming a knight. The cost of a warhorse, armor, and weapons was astronomical. The famous code of chivalry was also more of an ideal than a rule. Knights often acted with impunity, terrorizing villages or attacking clergy without consequence. And battle itself wasn't a series of noble duels, it was brutal, close-quarters chaos of hacking and slashing. Even then, the biggest killer on campaign wasn't a sword, but disease. Dysentery, spread by contaminated water in army camps, could wipe out far more soldiers than any enemy could. In the Middle Ages, you couldn't just wear whatever you felt like. Your clothes were a uniform that showed everyone your exact place in society. This was enforced by something called sumptuary laws, which were designed to keep the social classes distinct. Breaking them could get you fined or publicly humiliated. These laws dictated everything: the fabrics, the colors, even the accessories you were allowed to wear. For example, only high-ranking nobles might be allowed to wear certain luxurious furs or fabrics like velvet. Specific shades of purple or crimson silk were often reserved for royalty. Peasants were stuck with rough, scratchy wool or linen in drab, earthy colors. The laws were a constant reminder that you were born into your station. You were born a peasant, you dressed like a peasant, and you would almost certainly die a peasant. When the sun went down in a medieval town, the world became a place of deep, profound darkness, with no streetlights. The only light came from the moon or a torch carried by someone rich enough to afford it. The pitch-black streets were a perfect hunting ground for criminals. Robbery and assault were common. And walking alone at night was basically asking for trouble. Most towns had a strict curfew. When the bell rang, the city gates were locked, and you were expected to be inside, behind a bolted door. But the dangers weren't just outside. Fire was a constant, terrifying threat. Buildings were made of wood and thatch, so a single stray spark could set off a blaze that might destroy an entire neighborhood in hours. Between the crime and the risk of fire, the medieval night was something to be feared, not enjoyed. Today, we tend to put our cemeteries in quiet, separate areas, but in the Middle Ages, death was a much more visible part of daily life. Cemeteries and churchyards weren't walled off on the edge of town. They were right in the center of it, woven into the fabric of the community. These graveyards often served as public spaces. People would gather there, children might play among the headstones, and public announcements were sometimes made. This casual attitude toward the dead came from a worldview where the afterlife was a certainty, so the physical remains weren't seen with the same fear we might have today. Life and death existed side by side in a way that's almost impossible for us to imagine now, blurring the line between the world of the living and the world of the dead. So there you have it. From sewage in the streets to animals on trial, the Middle Ages were a lot darker and stranger than the fairy tales let on. It was a world of filth, fear, and bizarre beliefs, where just making it to the next sunrise was a real achievement. But it was also an age of incredible human resilience. What other harsh truths about the Middle Ages do you know? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching.